In the late summer of 1881, a woman named Cora Finch came to own the most useless piece of land in Harlan County, Nevada. And she did it because no one else wanted it. The property sat at the eastern rim of the Quentin Valley, where a shallow pond had spread across 4 acres of otherwise decent bottomland for as long as anyone in the territory could recall. The pond was fed by a seep spring beneath the surface, cold and dependable, but the water sat still and green in August, and the mud at its edge could swallow a boot to the ankle. Nobody grew anything along its banks. Nobody built near it. The man who had held the deed before Cora, a cattle speculator from Sacramento named Horace Rudd, had acquired it in a poker debt 11 years prior and paid taxes on it every year, like a man performing a small, pointless penance. When he died in June of 1881, his estate went to auction, and the pond lot came up last. Cora was 27 years old that summer. She had $46 to her name, a leather surveying satchel her father had owned, and a copy of his irrigation manual, water-stained along the spine from years of being carried into the field. Her father, Walt Finch, had been a hydraulic engineer by training and a ditch digger by necessity, and he had died 2 springs before of a lung sickness that took him in 3 weeks. He had taught Cora everything he knew about water before he was too weak to talk. He had shown her how to read the grade of land, how to find where water wanted to go when you let it, how a modest seep could water 50 acres if you gave it the right channel to follow. Walt Finch had worked survey contracts across Nevada and Utah for 20 years, mapping water rights and cutting grade stakes for irrigation companies that were sometimes reputable and sometimes not. He was a lean man with a surveyor's habit of tilting his head when he looked at ground, reading slope the way a reader reads a sentence, left to right, low point to high. He had carried Cora into the field with him from the time she was old enough to hold a rod steady, and he had not treated the work differently because she was a girl. He had given her the rod and told her to call the numbers, and when she called them wrong, he corrected her without irritation, the same way he corrected everything once, plainly expecting it to hold. The notebook she carried had been his. The notations in the first third of it were his handwriting, spare and vertical. The rest was hers, learning his hand. He had told her, the last autumn before the sickness came, that a spring seep was the most reliable thing in the territory if you treated it correctly. River water rose and fell with the season, he said, and a man who built his livelihood on a river was building it on a variable. A seep spring came out of limestone at the same volume in August that it came out in April. You could plan a harvest around a seep spring. You could build a life around it. All it asked was a channel, and a channel was something a person with a spade and patience could always provide. She bid $6.50 on the pond lot. A drover named Calder, standing near the back of the crowd, laughed so hard he had to lean on his companion. The auctioneer, a careful man named Frost who had been selling Harlan County property for 20 years, said nothing. But his expression was the expression of a man watching someone burn money to stay warm. The crowd at the Rudd Estate auction was not large. Perhaps 30 people gathered in the thin morning shade of the livery yard where the lots were being called. Most of the Rudd Estate had gone quickly. The livestock first, then the tools, then the upper pasture and the timber rights on the north slope, all of it moving to familiar hands at prices that nobody disputed. The pond lot came up when the crowd was already dispersing toward the midday meal. Frost called it out as 4 acres, bottomland, east rim, spring-fed, and added nothing further because there was nothing further to add that would help him. Cora had been standing near the fence since the morning's start. She had done her calculations 3 nights running at the kitchen table and had arrived at $6.50 as the number she could spend. and still keep enough in reserve to buy a half-dozen iron-grade pegs and a second flat spade. She was prepared to go higher if she had to. She did not have to. No one bid against her. The pond lot passed to Cora Finch for $6.50, and she walked home that evening carrying the deed in her surveying satchel, the sun going down over the western ridgeline in sheets of amber and copper. The deed was a single folded sheet, official territorial form, with the lot dimensions and the spring noted in the county clerk's plain hand. She read it twice on the walk home and then put it away. The neighbors stopped speaking to her before the week was out. If you have ever watched a community decide that a person has lost their good sense, you know how quickly and thoroughly the decision gets made. There is no announcement, no confrontation. The silence simply closes like water over a stone. In Harlan County that summer, word moved the way word always moved in a small territory town, from the feed merchant to the barber to the women at the post office, and the word was that Cora had bought the pond lot for nothing and was planning to drain it, which was the most pointless and eccentric piece of property management anyone had heard of in recent memory. People who had waved to her from across the road the week before now found somewhere else to look. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peel, who had traded preserves with Cora every fall for 3 years, stopped leaving jars on the fence post. Cora noticed. She was not the kind of person who pretended not to notice things. She noticed the way a surveyor notices a grade, not with drama but with precision. The silence had a shape, and she measured it the same way she measured the pond, by walking its edges and writing down what she found. Mrs. Peel's fence post, empty for the first time in 3 autumns. The feed merchant, who had always found a reason to talk about her father's work when she came in, now suddenly occupied with his ledgers. These were the small measurements of a community's opinion, and they were accurate. She did not quarrel with them. She went to work instead. She spent the first week walking the pond lot with her father's surveying rod and a length of string, pegging grades into the soft earth and writing numbers in a small notebook. The seep spring, she confirmed, emerged from the ground at the pond's northeastern corner, where a limestone shelf pushed up through the clay. It discharged cold, clear water at a volume she estimated at roughly 40 gallons per minute, possibly more in a wet season. The pond existed only because the water had no channel to follow, no outlet carved into the land. The ground to the west and southwest fell away at a consistent grade across the full breadth of the Quentin Valley bottomland, dry and cracked in August. Waiting, she pegged the grade at intervals of 20 feet, driving a stake and recording the elevation differential with the rod until she had a complete line of numbers from the spring corner to the valley floor, 300 yards to the southwest. She recorded them in a column and ran the arithmetic twice. The fall was consistent, 2 feet and 40 the whole length of the run. She had seen her father stake claims on worse ground than this and deliver water to every acre of them. The distribution potential, once the plug was out and the outlet was free, was significant. Perhaps 30 acres could be watered from the main grade channel and its laterals, given adequate maintenance. Possibly more in a year with a full spring. She was on the 3rd day of her survey when she allowed herself to write the estimate in the notebook as a number rather than a possibility. 30 acres, watered, was good bottomland in the Quentin Valley. Good bottomland in the Quentin Valley was worth more per acre than any 4-acre pond lot that had sold at auction in recent memory. She had been measuring and calculating for 4 days when an old man appeared at the edge of the lot and stood watching her. His name was Deke Sorrells. He was 70 or thereabouts, a former ditch rider for the Quentin Land Company who had worked the valley's water allotments for 30 years before the company folded. He wore a battered hat and carried a walking stick he had whittled from a juniper branch, and he watched Cora work with the rod and string for a long time before he said anything. Most folks would have left that deed in the auctioneer's waste bin, he said. Most folks did, she said without looking up from the grade peg she was driving. He was quiet for another stretch. Then, "You reading the drainage line?" "Southwest to the valley floor," she said. "There is a fall of 2 feet in every 40 from the spring outflow to the first bench. More below that." Deke Sorrells leaned on his juniper stick and looked at the parched bottomland to the west. 40 gallons a minute, he said slowly, as if working something out. Steady flow. Cold enough it will not evaporate fast. If I open a grade channel from the spring outflow to the first lateral and cut distribution ditches at the benches, I can water the bottomland all the way to the valley road. She did pause then and looked at him. The problem is the caliche layer, 18 inches down on the southwest slope. It is going to blunt the digging. Deke Sorrells had not intended to get involved. He had come, he said later, simply to see what the Finch woman was doing, because the valley had been talking of nothing else, and he liked to form his own opinions. He stood there another moment, studying the grade pegs, looking from the spring corner to the dry southwestern flat. "I have a caliche bar," he said at last. "Hardened steel. Heavy thing. My back will not carry it anymore." Cora nodded. "I will carry it," she said. He brought it the next morning. The work of draining a 4-acre pond and redirecting its source water across a grade-cut channel is not work that announces itself in dramatic turns. It is patient, methodical, and it hurts before it yields. Cora began at the spring corner where the limestone shelf lifted and the water pooled first. She cut through the pond's eastern mud wall with a flat spade, working in the cool of the early morning before the sun climbed and the gnats came off the water in clouds. Deke Sorrells came each day after breakfast and sat on an overturned bucket and told her about the caliche layer, where it thickened and where it gave, how the old ditch riders used to angle the caliche bar at 30 degrees to fracture it in sheets rather than hammering straight down, which wore the wrists to nothing. She listened. She adjusted her angle. The caliche bar weighed 11 pounds, and she worked it for 2 hours each morning before switching back to the flat spade. The first week taught her the pond's character. The mud at the eastern bank was deep and cold, holding shape below the surface while the upper skin dried to a gray crust in the afternoon heat. The flat spade went in easily there, but the walls of the cut kept slumping, collapsing sideways into the channel she was opening as fast as she could clear them. On the 5th day, she drove planks on either side of the cut with the back of the spade, borrowed from a pile of scrap lumber behind Deke's barn, and the channel held after that. The caliche layer gave her the most trouble. On the 8th day, she struck a band of it at 14 inches that ran the full width of the drainage path, harder than what Deke had described, pale and dense and barely scoring under the bar. She worked it for 4 days, fracturing it in sections, and she lost skin from the heels of both hands doing it, the grip on the bar wearing through her work gloves by the 3rd day. She wrapped her hands with cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. The pond gave up its water slowly. By the end of the 2nd week, the surface had dropped 8 inches and the green August scum had begun to recede from the eastern bank, exposing dark mud that the sun cracked into plates. A pair of herons that had haunted the pond's edge for years departed without ceremony, lifting together one morning and angling south. Cora watched them go and then went back to work. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs to work that is not yet understood, where the hands are moving and the purpose is plain, but the meaning has not arrived. Cora worked inside that silence for 19 days, and no one in the valley came to ask her what she expected to find. They already had their answer. She was a woman who had spent good money on a worthless pond lot and was now destroying the one unremarkable thing the lot possessed. This was the verdict of Harlan County, and for 19 days it went uncontested. It was on the 19th day that she found the first post. She had been digging along the pond's north wall, working the grade channel toward the spring outflow, when the flat spade struck something that was not caliche and not limestone. She stopped. She moved slowly, trading the flat spade for a narrower pointing trowel she carried in her satchel, and she began clearing the wet, dark mud away from the obstruction with careful strokes. What emerged over the next hour was a wooden surveying post, 3 inches square and 4 feet long, driven into the clay beneath the pond floor. On its upper face, just below the water line that had covered it for years, someone had cut a mark with a sharp instrument, a letter, then a number. She cleaned it with the hem of her work apron and held it up to the morning light. The letter was Q. The number was 3. She knew what a Q post was. Her father had told her about the Quentin Land Company's surveying system, how the company had marked its original water allotments in the late 1860s with a set of lettered and numbered boundary posts before the company's officers were indicted for land fraud in 1874, and the whole enterprise collapsed. The posts, he had said, were the original measurement of water rights in the valley, each one tied to an allotment deed recorded at the Territorial Land Office in Carson City. Walt Finch had seen a few of them exposed during a dry year in 1876 at the edges of dried-up ditches east of the Valley Road. He had described them to her while they ate supper one evening, saying a Q post under 2 feet of pond mud meant a water right sitting underwater waiting to be noticed. And he had said it the way he said most things, as an observation of fact, rather than a hint toward anything in particular. He could not have known his daughter would one day buy the pond that covered them. He had never mentioned one beneath this pond. Cora set the post at the edge of the lot and marked its position in her notebook with a careful notation of depth, angle, and distance from the spring corner. She continued digging. She found 3 more posts in the following 4 days. Each was cut with the letter Q and a number, and each was driven into the clay of the pond floor at a depth that suggested the pond itself had risen over them gradually, filling in across a period of years, covering the markers as the spring seep spread, and the natural outlet had silted shut. A pond, she understood now, that had not always been a pond. The second post, Q4, came up 20 feet south of the first, at 18 inches depth in stiff gray clay. The third, Q7, was in the softest mud of the pond's center, 30 inches down, and she had to cut the trowel work sideways to clear it without losing the marking. The fourth, Q12, she found at the southwestern edge of the old pond boundary, where the mud gave way to drier ground, and this one was driven shallower, only 12 inches. As if whoever placed it had run out of patience with the work or had been interrupted. All 4 were sound. The wood, a dense, close-grained post cedar, had held in the wet clay without significant rot. The Q marks and numbers were as clear as the day they had been cut. The spring seep had been flowing long before the Quentin Land Company arrived. Its output, unmolested, would have watered the bottomland naturally. Something had stopped the outlet. Something had closed the channel the water originally followed. She found what had closed it on the 23rd day. Digging at the pond's southwestern corner, she struck a layer of densely packed fill. Not the pond's natural clay, but material that had been brought in and worked down. Dry soil mixed with gravel and compressed in horizontal layers the way a man fills a trench. It was a plug, 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, and driven 2 feet into the natural grade, blocking the spring seep's original drainage path exactly. She spent the better part of that morning clearing the fill layer by layer, working slowly with the pointing trowel to preserve the horizontal divisions. There were 4 of them, each 1 inch to 2 inches deep, each compressed in the same direction as though the fill had been tamped in sections by someone working systematically from one end to the other. The bottom of the plug rested against a rim of limestone that had once been the edge of the spring seep's natural outlet, worn smooth by decades of water passing over it. Above that, the plug had held, and the outlet had not been worn smooth by anything, because nothing had passed through it. The plug was at least 7 years old, perhaps older. The gravel in it was river gravel from the valley floor, not local limestone, which meant someone had hauled it from the valley road half a mile distant and packed it in by hand or by barrow. This was not an accident of silting. This was not the natural accumulation of mud over a low point in the bank. It had been installed deliberately. Someone had closed the outlet of the spring seep and let the water rise. Cora sat back on her heels in the August mud and looked at the 4 surveying posts lined up at the edge of the lot and thought about that for a long time. The silence around her was the silence of the valley in late summer, the dry grass still, the distant ridgeline holding its heat. Somewhere west of her, the bottomland waited, cracked and pale. Somewhere in Carson City, she suspected, a ledger sat open on a page that had not been turned in 7 years. She went to see Deke Sorrells that evening. He was sitting on his porch with his hat off and a cup of cold coffee at his knee, and he listened to what she had found without interrupting her. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, looking at the darkening tree line to the west. "The Quentin Land Company," he said, "sold water allotments to 31 homestead families in this valley between 1867 and 1873. Each family paid between $40 and $90 for a measured allotment, tied to a post, registered at the land office. The water was supposed to come from the spring seep in perpetuity, distributed through a grade channel the company was obligated to cut." He looked at his cup. The channel was never cut. The families watered from the river instead, at their own expense, and when the company folded in 1874, the whole matter was written off as an administrative failure. "The families never got their allotments," Cora said. "They got nothing. Several of them left the valley. 2 are still here, holding land they paid water rights for and never received." He looked at her. "The Haverstock family, down on the south bench, and old Thomas Cruz, who has the quarter section at the base of the ridge." She asked him whether he had ever known about the fill plug. He shook his head slowly. "I knew the channel was never cut," he said. "I did not know why." Cora walked home in the dark with her notebook pressed against her chest and her father's satchel swinging at her hip. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Carson City the following morning. She enclosed in it a careful sketch of the 4 Q posts with their depths and positions, a measured diagram of the fill plug with its layered composition noted, and a copy of the original spring seep volume estimate from her notebook. She asked the office to confirm the status of Quentin Land Company, allotment Q3, and the adjacent lots Q4, Q7, and Q12, which were the numbers on the posts she had recovered. What does a person do while waiting for a reply from a government office? She digs, she measures, she cuts the next lateral and drives the grade pegs for the one after that, and she does not allow the waiting to become an occasion for doubt. Cora worked the distribution channel in the mornings and wrote in her notebook in the evenings, and she did not speak to anyone about what she had found except Deke Sorrells, who kept his own counsel on the matter, the way an old man keeps a promise, quietly and without being asked. She did allow herself one thing during the wait, a single evening spent reading through her father's irrigation manual from front to back, not for instruction but for company. Walt Finch had penciled notes in the margins of several pages, brief and precise, the kind of additions a working engineer makes when the printed rule does not account for field conditions. On page 47 in his vertical hand, he had written alongside a passage about spring seep management. Water pooled is water denied. Find the block, remove it, let it run. She had read that note before when the book was still new to her hands and had taken it as engineering counsel. Reading it now in August of 1881, with 4 Quentin Land Company survey posts lined up at the edge of the pond lot and a fill plug exposed in the southwestern corner, she took it as something else entirely. Her father had written it about water. It applied to other things as well. The reply came in 11 days. The clerk who wrote it was named Alvarez, and he wrote plainly. The 4 allotment numbers she named were registered at the land office against deeds issued in 1869 and 1871 to 4 purchasers, a family named Haverstock, a man named Thomas Cruz, a widow named Renfrew, who had sold her quarter section in 1876 and left the territory, and a 3rd homesteader named Bauer, whose land had passed through 2 subsequent sales and was now held by a different family altogether. The allotments had been listed as undelivered in the Quentin Land Company's 1874 dissolution filing, assessed at a combined value of $216 in 1874 money, and carried in the territory's unclaimed obligations ledger ever since. $216 in unclaimed obligations. The land office still held the account. She read the letter twice, standing at her kitchen table in the morning light, and then she folded it and placed it inside the cover of her father's irrigation manual, which was the place she put things she did not want to lose. She understood now what the pond was. The spring seep had watered this corner of the Quentin Valley before the land company arrived. Someone in the company's management, understanding that the seep was the practical source for the allotment system, had blocked its natural outflow and let the water pool, rather than cut the grade channel the company owed its purchasers. A pond was cheaper than a ditch. The allotment holders had waited a year, then 2, and when the channel never came and the company folded, they had absorbed their losses and moved on. The spring seep had sat beneath a useless pond for 7 years, its obligations frozen in a ledger in Carson City, because the right person had never thought to look at what was under the water. If the outlet had never been plugged, there would have been no pond. There would have been a ditch and 40 acres of watered bottomland, and 4 homesteaders receiving what they had paid for. She spent the last week of August finishing the drainage channel and cutting the first 2 distribution laterals along the southwestern grade. The pond dropped steadily, and by the end of the month, the spring seep was running free for the first time in years, following the grade she had opened for it, spreading cold, clear water along the first lateral and soaking into the dry bottomland in a dark, advancing front that pressed the cracked earth down as it moved. She stood at the head of the channel one evening and watched the water go, the light going orange along the ridge behind her, the bottomland beginning to show wet at its edges. Her father had told her once that water given the right channel will find its own way to the end of it, that the work of a hydraulic engineer is not to move the water, but to stop preventing it from moving. She had understood the principle at the time. Standing here watching the seep run free for the first time in 7 years, she understood the weight of it. Deke Sorrells brought Thomas Cruz to see it on the first day of September. Cruz was 62, a compact and quiet man who had been farming the base of the ridge for 14 years. On river water he hauled himself, and he stood at the head of Cora's distribution lateral and watched the water run for a long time, without speaking. "That comes from the spring," he said at last, "the seep spring. It has been coming from there for some years," she said. "It simply had no path to follow until now." He looked at her and then at the running ditch and then at the dry ground ahead of it where the water was moving. She had already written to the Haverstock family, who farmed the south bench half a mile away. Elsa Haverstock came 2 days later, a spare woman in her 50s with hands like her father's, she said, who had first bought the allotment in 1869. She walked the length of Cora's grade channel without speaking, and then stood at the head lateral and watched the water spreading. My father paid $70 for the Q7 allotment, Elsa said, in 1869. He told me about it every year until he died. The obligation is still registered in Carson City, Cora said. The land office has confirmed it. You have a claim. Elsa turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, something older and more careful than either. You drained the pond to find this, she said. I drained the pond because the land was worth more dry, Cora said. What was under it was something I did not know to look for until I was already digging. This was true, and it was also the kind of truth that left certain things unsaid. She had not known what the posts meant until she found them. She had not known the outlet was plugged until she hit the fill. Every step she took had been a step she could see from where she stood, no further, her father's surveying rod in the ground and his notebook in her hand. The work had led the work, the way a channel leads water, one gradient opening the path to the next. She filed the formal documentation with the Territorial Land Office in the 3rd week of September. Deke Searles helped her organize the record, the diagram of the Q posts, the fill plug measurements, the original spring volume estimate, the land office's confirmation of the 4 outstanding allotment obligations. He wrote a sworn account of his own knowledge as a former ditch rider for the Quentin Land Company, attesting that the grade channel obligated under the allotment contracts had never been cut, and that the company's officers had been aware of this at the time of dissolution. The Quentin Land Company had been dissolved 7 years prior. Its managing officer, a man named Elbert Crane, had relocated to San Francisco after the 1874 indictment proceedings collapsed for lack of evidence, and had since operated a real estate brokerage there. The obligation, the land office determined, did not rest with Crane personally, but with the unclaimed assets account held against the dissolved company's registered obligations, which the territory had been maintaining since the dissolution filing. It was a bureaucratic distinction, and Cora understood the distinction, and the distinction held. $216 in principal, plus 7 years of simple interest at the territorial rate of 6% per year. The calculation took the Carson City clerk approximately 20 minutes. The checks arrived in Harlan County in the last week of October. Cora carried them herself, in envelopes sealed with the land office's stamp, because she had been the one to file and she did not want them handed to anyone else along the way. She left the first one with Thomas Cruz, who read the amount and set it on his kitchen table and looked at it for a long time before he said anything. When he looked up, his expression was composed, but the set of his jaw had changed. Some tension she had not known was there gone out of it. This is the allotment, he said. Not a question. With interest at 6% from 1874, she said. The land office calculated it. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, and looked at the envelope again. Cruz had bought the Q3 allotment in 1871, the year his family arrived in the valley from Sonora, and had paid $60 for it, a sum that had represented several months of wages at the time. He had told Deke Searles the story once, years ago, and Deke had passed it to Cora without embellishment. $60 for a water right that had never delivered a single gallon. He had not spoken of it since, as far as Deke knew, which was the way men like Cruz managed the things that had been taken from them. He did not say thank you. Cora had not expected him to. The money was not a gift. It was an obligation discharged, and gratitude for the return of what was owed you was a currency that mixed awkwardly with the original debt. She left him at his kitchen table and walked back down the ridge road in the October cold. She left the second one with Elsa Haverstock, who held it in both hands and stood in her kitchen doorway, looking at the south bench of the Quentin Valley for a long moment. $70, she said quietly. My father paid $70. With interest, Cora said. $112.40. Elsa folded the envelope carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went back inside without another word. Cora understood this was not coldness. Some things settle in silence. The third and fourth obligations went to the land office for the Renfrew and Bauer successors, which was a matter for lawyers in the territory to manage. And Cora did not concern herself with them beyond the filing. She had her own accounting to close. The $6.50 she had paid for the pond lot had purchased 4 acres of Nevada clay and a spring seep that, once redirected, would water 30 acres of bottomland along the western grade. She spent October finishing the distribution lateral network, cutting 3 additional branches from the main grade channel, and laying flat stones at the switchback points to keep the flow from cutting the banks. Deke Sorrells directed from his bucket, telling her about the old Quentin ditch patterns, where the grade had originally been meant to run before the company abandoned the work. She followed his directions and her father's calculations, and the water followed her. By the time the first frost came to the Quentin Valley, the bottomland west of the pond lot was dark with moisture. The spring seep ran clear and cold through a channel that had not existed 3 months before, and the 4 acres where the pond had been were graded flat, their clay surface beginning to dry and crack in the patterns of soil that would support something planted in the spring. The neighbors had begun to speak to her again sometime in September, not all at once and without any ceremony, which was the way things went in Harlan County. A man at the feed store asked about the channel grade. One of the Peel women stopped her on the road and said she had heard something about a land office matter from Carson City. Cora answered their questions plainly and did not remark on the weeks of silence. She did not need to. The drover Calder, who had laughed at the auction, passed her one morning in October on the Valley Road. He said nothing, but he touched the brim of his hat. Cora nodded and kept walking. There was no speech worth making. The work had said what needed saying, and anything she added on top of it would only diminish what the work had done on its own. If you have ever known a woman like her, the kind who measures the ground before she moves it and trusts the numbers more than she trusts the opinion of a crowd, you know that the deepest satisfaction in her kind of life is not the moment of vindication. Vindication is just a weight lifted, the absence of a pressure that should not have been there. The deeper thing is the channel, the path cut where no path was, the water moving along the grade it was always meant to follow, cold and steady and continuous. The rightness of a thing returned to its proper course. In the spring of 1882, Thomas Cruise planted alfalfa on the south half of his quarter section, in soil watered by the distribution lateral Cora had cut. Elsa Haverstock put in 3 rows of orchard apple on the lower bench. Deke Sorrells, who was too old to farm but not too old to advise, told anyone who would listen that the grade channel was the finest piece of hydraulic engineering in the valley, which it was, because it was the only piece of hydraulic engineering in the valley, and because Walt Finch had taught his daughter to measure the ground before she moved it. The alfalfa came up green in May. The apple trees took their time, as apple trees do, holding what they had been given and moving toward the light at their own pace. Elsa Haverstock walked the orchard rows on a morning in early June, the new leaves pale and translucent in the low angle of the sun, the ground at the roots dark with moisture from the lateral, and she stopped at the end of the 3rd row and stood there for a time, in the way a person stands when a long-held debt has finally been settled and the ledger is clean at last. And in the early mornings that spring, when Cora went out to check the laterals before the day warmed, she could stand at the head of the main grade channel and hear the spring running steadily over the flat stones. The same water that had pooled and stagnated for 7 years, now moving through the grade she had cut, spreading across the dark bottomland in a slow and patient advance that asked nothing of anyone, only the slope of the ground and the time to follow it down. She stood there some mornings longer than she needed to. The surveying satchel was at her hip, its leather stained with Nevada clay. The notebook was dry. The water ran where it had always meant to run, and the ground on either side of the channel was the deep, damp color of land that is being used at last for the thing it was meant to sustain. The pond was gone. The spring ran free. What her father had known about water and had taken care to pass along before he could not, had found the ground it was looking for. If this story settled something in you, the way a debt finally discharged settles something in the chest, leave a word in the comments. We are glad to know when a story like this one lands where it was meant to. And if you want to hear what another woman uncovered when she opened a thing the world had written off, there is one waiting just ahead. This story is a work of historical fiction set in the Nevada frontier territories of the 1880s. The Quinton Land Company, its officers, and all named characters are invented. The hydraulic engineering practices, territorial land office procedures, water allotment systems, and social conditions depicted are drawn from historical research into the period and region. Any errors in those particulars belong to the telling.